You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
My name is Satula May, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program from the East-West Center on the United States' enhanced and enduring commitment to the Pacific Islands region. We welcome you all from wherever you're joining us and at whatever time. We have a distinguished panel of U.S. government officials who will offer their perspectives on United States relations with the region, the Pacific Island countries, followed by a moderated discussion. Today's format is very simple. Each of the officials that has agreed to speak today will go in the order that was on your invitation and on the program announcement. And then we will move to a 30-minute moderated discussion at the end of their prepared remarks. I welcome all of you, and specifically and especially, I welcome the U.S. government officials who've agreed to speak with us today. And for those of you who are joining us on live stream YouTube, welcome to you as well. It is my great pleasure to introduce each of them, but if I were to go into their biographies, their distinctions, their accomplishments, their service to the nation, it would take the entire program. So please forgive me if I simply refer you to their biographies in the materials for this program and simply announce their name and their position so that we might benefit most from their perspective and their views on U.S. relations with the Pacific Island countries. With that in mind, let me please welcome first and foremost the speaker for today, the Acting Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Mr. John Barsa. Welcome, Mr. Barsa, and I would invite you to make your remarks.
Thank you so very much. I'm really grateful for the introduction. It's a pleasure to speak with you today on behalf of the U.S. Agency for International Development. The U.S. government knows how crucial our Pacific neighbors are in fostering a free and open Indo-Pacific region. And we've had a long-standing commitment to the Pacific Islands. Yet the region's stability and vitality continue to be threatened by debilitating natural disasters, development challenges, and malign actors who engage in predatory economic activities. For the Pacific Islands regions to flourish, each nation must be free to determine its own course. And we're working with allies and partners to help the countries of this part of the world achieve true self-reliance. Our partnership in the Pacific region, including with regional institutions such as the Pacific Islands Forum, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, and the Pacific Community, advance shared priorities in the region, which include natural disaster resiliency, transparent and high standard infrastructure financing, private sector-led growth, good government, and sustainable development. And we are so thankful to collaborate with countries in the Pacific like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and Taiwan, who have similar goals to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific. Together, we believe in the promise of transparent and inclusive development. Under the Pacific Pledge, which is what the United States calls our commitment to the region under the Indo-Pacific strategy, our partnerships are stronger than ever, and USAID is advancing this pledge through even more engagement. Today, we are excited to announce an expansion of new staffing in the Indo-Pacific, specifically in the Solomon Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau, as well as increased staffing in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. Along with the expansion in staffing comes a surge in financial assistance. In fact, our assistance to the Pacific region has more than quadrupled over the past 10 years, from roughly $20 million to $85 million today. And as part of that increase in funding, I'm pleased to announce that we are in the process of awarding the first two of what will be dozens of grants under USAID's new Pacific American Fund. Launched just last month, this 5-year regional grant facility is designed to support civil society organizations and private sector enterprises in advancing locally designed and led development solutions. The goal is to increase resilience, improve quality of life, and provide access to services in vulnerable and remote Pacific Island communities. The first two grants that will be awarded under the Pacific American Fund are COVID-19 rapid response grants given to local organizations to respond to and mitigate economic and social impacts. These two proposed recipients are expected to improve food security and increase incomes for rural coastal communities in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands through the development of small-scale, sustainable aquaculture enterprises. We are excited and proud to ramp up support for economic development in the Indo-Pacific. And this announcement today follows on other major announcements from USAID in recent weeks. One of these had to do with our commitment to build a new fiber optic cable connection to the Republic of Palau. This will give the country greater reliability and security in both telecommunications and internet access. In another major announcement, we launched a new project that advances the U.S. government's commitment under the Papua New Guinea Electrification Partnership. This project will significantly boost efforts to expand electricity access from 13 to 70% of the population by 2030. And a final example of the commitments we're making to advance Indo-Pacific development is USAID's new program in the Solomon Islands. This program will strengthen the enabling environment to unlock economic opportunities, improve natural resource management, promote agribusiness and small enterprise development, and expand critical small-scale infrastructure. And we have even more activities to announce in the weeks and months ahead. We are committed to putting resources and effort into our shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And we're doubling down on this commitment by preparing to launch 3 new regional programs. Together, these new programs will have major impacts in the region. They will advance citizen-responsive democratic governance by strengthening institutions and improving public financing management. They'll improve the enabling environment for trade and investment, and they will expand access to open, reliable, and secure digital connectivity infrastructure in remote atolls and islands. I'm excited to watch these programs come to fruition. We've made tremendous progress with our partners in the Pacific region, and we know that great things await us all in the future. Thanks to you, and back to Dr. Delamay.
Thank you, Mr. Barsa. Those are some terrific and exciting new initiatives for our relations with the Pacific Island countries, and I thank you for taking the time to share them with us. We now turn to Congressman McCaul, who represents the 10th District of Texas and is the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has a long serving in his 8th term. Welcome, Representative McCaul. May I invite you to please make some remarks?
Okay, thanks a lot too in the East West Center for having me today. It's great to be here with my friends like Administrator Barsa, Admiral Davidson, Congressman Case, and Assistant Secretary Stilwell. The Chinese Communist Party is now more aggressive, more expansive, more sophisticated, and better resourced than they were even just 10 years ago. They are the world's greatest threat to our freedom, especially in the Indo-Pacific. This regime has allowed the coronavirus pandemic to destroy important industries and fragile supply chains that so many Pacific states rely on. The CCP's Belt and Road Initiative endangers vulnerable economies and undermines nations' sovereignty. And this debt trap diplomacy goes hand in hand with the CCP's military encroachment in the region. As many of you know, I was appointed by Leader McCarthy earlier this year to lead the China Task Force. After months of investigation and meetings with 130 leaders, we released our China Task Force report on how the United States should confront the growing threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. In total, our report had 82 key findings and more than 400 total recommendations. And of the legislation we recommended for action, 2/3 of those were bipartisan and 1/3 have already passed either the House or the Senate. And we anticipate that 1/4 of these recommendations, including in the National Defense Authorization Bill, which will be coming up, and I'm a conference chair too, will be signed into law by the end of this year. Many of the recommendations in the China Task Force report center on working with our allies, especially those in the Pacific. We often forget the United States is also a Pacific nation, and American soil does not stop at California's coast, but extends all the way to Guam. And during the Second World War, millions of Americans fought and tens of thousands died to keep the Pacific free. My father was one of those brave fighters. He, in the European theater, part of the D-Day air campaign, bombardier in a B-17, had the great opportunity to go to Normandy in the 75th anniversary. But now, 75 years after the end of World War II, the United States remains committed to a free, open, prosperous, and secure Pacific. We share family ties, we share cultural ties, and we share religious ties with the people of the Pacific nations, many of whom serve in the United States Armed Forces. and our national security interests are more aligned each day. So I want to assure our Pacific partners that Congress will keep working on a bipartisan basis to deepen our relations and counter these generational threats. And we'll continue to champion American economic engagement abroad through legislation like the BUILD Act, which helps spark private sector-led economic growth. In fact, the Development Finance Corporation Director, Adam Bowler, had dinner at his house the other day, and we talked about the Asian Pacific piece specifically with the foreign minister from Indonesia. I think the South China Sea is an area of great interest with the border of Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, all in that region. So as a lead Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I've approved the redeployment also of the Peace Corps in the region. I believe the Peace Corps has done great work and great ambassadors of the United States in the Pacific area. In addition, I've approved the State Department's first steps towards opening an embassy in the Solomon Islands for the first time. And we are standing by to support the negotiation of new compacts with the freely associated states. So as we move forward, American engagement in the Pacific will keep growing. We will continue to be a reliable partner that respects the sovereignty of our neighbors and friends, while at the same time being an ally to protect them from the malign influence of enemy nation states. And so with that, I want to again thank the East-West Center. Been a great resource for me personally and for the Foreign Affairs Committee. And Satu, great to see your face again. And God bless all of you. Have a great day. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Congressman McCaul, particularly for your remarks that frame the geopolitical challenges we face in the overall region and connecting our relations with the Pacific Islands to that geopolitical context. And of course, your support for various activities across the U.S. government to deal with the region. You mentioned DFC, you mentioned a new embassy in the Solomons. So thank you very much indeed. We now have the honor and pleasure to hear from Admiral Philip Davidson. He is the 25th Commander of United States Indo-Pacific Command. He has, of course, decades in the service of the United States Navy and now in his current position. Welcome, Admiral Davidson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and good morning and aloha, everyone from Hawaii. I'd like also to thank my fellow panelists here for their comments today, and thank you to Congressman McCaul and Administrator Barsa for their comments. And thank you to the East-West Center for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion and take a few questions afterwards. The United States has long been committed to our allies and partners in promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific, and we remain dedicated to the Pacific Islands' future security and prosperity. This commitment includes the dedicated resources, the consistent effort to enhance capacity building, and the direct training of people across the Pacific Island chain to support the current and future security challenges facing the Pacific Islands. Of course, our first and foremost priority in the Pacific Islands is the defense of U.S. territories and protection of our American citizens. The next priority is to the freely associated states, Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, which the United States maintains both security and direct defense obligations. But of course, we're also working closely across the whole of the region, including Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and others to ensure peace and stability in line with our free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And as we deepen our engagement in the Pacific Islands, we will continue to look to increase our activities alongside our allies and partners in the region. Our intent is to build upon our historic and cultural links, build on our shared values, and help address the major security challenges, including illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, narcotics and human trafficking, help provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief when called upon, as well as develop the capability and capacity to mitigate disease and pandemics in the region. Of course, we continue to enhance our support to regional security by broadening our military exercises increasing the number of defense attachés, and expanding our National Guard State Partnership Program throughout the Indo-Pacific to deal with more traditional military security challenges as well. But in terms of maritime security, we also have 13 shipwrighter agreements in the region where we embark defense and law enforcement officials from Pacific Island nations to U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. Navy ships to help enhance our understanding of the maritime domain and help enhance maritime security awareness with our partners in the region. We are deeply interested and continue to contribute to the development of fusion centers in Singapore and throughout the Pacific. These fusion centers help combine and analyze sensor data from aircraft, from ships, and from space-based systems to help build a common maritime picture, and together with the Pacific Island countries that are involved, improve our collective awareness of what's happening in the maritime domain. This helps improve the understanding of what's happening within the exclusive economic zones, as well as give the insights that are necessary to deal with challenges like illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. I believe it is in all of our interests to broaden the information sharing necessary to enhance our security and our access to the global commons. And as I mentioned, U.S. INDOPACOM also contributes to the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts in the Pacific Islands. As an example, INDOPACOM provided active duty forces to the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands for nearly 5 months in 2018 and early 2019, following a devastating 500-year storm. This joint force of personnel, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, help clear roads, fix roofs, and provide basic necessities like drinking water. In addition to providing direct support like that, at U.S. INDOPACOM, we have a Center for Excellence in Disaster Management as well. This training and education site is dedicated to training U.S. and foreign military personnel, government officials, and non-governmental agents in how to command and control the resources necessary to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the wake of natural or man-made disasters. In fact, we export this course to other countries, and during the COVID pandemic, we've successfully been able to conduct a virtual training across the globe. Lastly, the U.S. continues to complement, coordinate, and collaborate with our allies and partners to help counter malign behavior, corruption, and coercion throughout the Indo-Pacific. We work with allies and partners to ensure the freedom of the seas and skies, to ensure strategic lines of communication remain open, and to further demonstrate our commitment to the security and prosperity of the region. The Pacific Quad is a wonderful example of a multilateral engagement and exists between the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and France. And it has been exceptionally effective in its coordination with the Foreign Fisheries Agency Regional Surveillance Center in the Solomon Islands, and in fighting against illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing in the Central and Western Pacific. Indeed, the United States engagement and enduring commitment to the Pacific Islands is fundamental to our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you and aloha.
Thank you very much, Admiral Davidson, for those remarks, and particularly gratifying to hear the range of operational activities that are going on under your leadership of Indo-Pacific Command. So thank you very much indeed. We now turn to Congressman Ed Case, who represents the 1st Congressional District. Previously, he represented Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District. And for the purposes of today's program, he is also, I would note, the co-chair, founding co-chair of the Pacific Islands Caucus. Great to have you with us, Congressman Case. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, and Satu, the East-West Center, and all of the great participants on the call. A fond aloha from Washington, D.C. It is an incredible honor to join such a thoughtful and distinguished panel today to focus attention on the Pacific Islands, an incredible and integral and critical part of our world. I especially want to recognize my colleague, Mr. McCaul, whose participation today reflects his shared commitment in the Pacific. And I've got two constituents presenting on the call as well that I want to recognize in particular, Secretary Stilwell on temporary assignment to Washington, D.C., and Admiral Davidson. You have been such a valued teacher and partner on the Pacific with me and so many others. Of course, as the U.S. representative for Hawaii's 1st Congressional District, I represent a vital part of our country that, along with American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, are from and of the Pacific Ohana, or family. Through Hawaii and our Pacific territories, as well as our shared interests, values, and histories, the United States is not some remote power to this region. The United States has been, is, and will remain a Pacific country. This year, of course, we honor the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and the grim reminder that we can never take the Pacific for granted. Together with so many others, countless Americans died to liberate our Pacific neighbors in storied battles, including Tarawa, Peleliu, Guadalcanal, and more. In my own district in Honolulu is the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, where so many of our warriors are buried. Although we in the Pacific know the critical importance of the Pacific, that has not always been true across the range and depth and breadth of Washington, D.C. But so many developments over the last decades have changed all of that, and we are trying to focus our attention as well in Congress. And to assure that Congress itself does muster our collective and coordinated focus on the Pacific Islands, last year, as Satu mentioned, I joined like-minded colleagues on both sides of the aisle to create the first ever Congressional Pacific Islands Caucus. Our caucus focuses specifically on the 26 jurisdictions or so that are spread across the length and breadth of the Pacific, independent countries, freely associated states, territories, all manner of jurisdictions, but that are united in the Pacific as Pacific Islands. And if you take their sum total of their land area and their maritime exclusive economic zones, actually total a larger area of our world than the land masses of China and Russia combined. We sometimes forget how vast the Pacific is. And in fact, we sometimes forget how much of our world is taken up with the Pacific Islands. They include the 12 independent states that are members of the United Nations, some self-governing, freely associated countries, and of course, states and territories such as Hawaii. Our Pacific Islands Caucus has become a platform for elevating issues central to this diverse region, including healthcare, education, marine resource management, good governance, and of course, climate change. This year, we followed up on founding of our caucus by drafting together, I would say, also with our partners around the Pacific and introducing into the United States Congress what we refer to as the Blue Pacific Bill, boosting long-term U.S. engagement in the Pacific, the Blue Pacific Bill, a bipartisan bill that establishes a comprehensive U.S. foreign policy for the Pacific Islands, focusing on three essential pillars: security, development, and shared values. Our legislation would expand diplomatic and development presence, increase maritime security cooperation and assistance, deepen and diversify trade, support regional economic and social development in areas like public health and education, invest in climate adaptation and climate resilient infrastructure, coordinate with existing regional institutions and like-minded allies and partners, promote shared values like press freedom and gender equality, and strengthen people-to-people relationships in civil society. It is exactly aligned with the efforts of the U.S. Agency for International Development, as mentioned earlier. It is supportive and expanded beyond that. When we named this bill, we not only paid tribute to the concept of the Blue Pacific embraced by the leaders of the Pacific Islands forums themselves as a shared identity and platform for collective action, but also intend for our efforts to be informed by and coordinated with the work of existing regional institutions and frameworks. This legislation would also integrate these programs with those of our like-minded allies and partners, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan, and many others who are involved as we are in the Pacific Islands. I want to take a moment to recognize the importance of Hawaii. After all, I do represent Hawaii in our country's engagement in foreign policy in the Pacific Islands region. Hawaii is home not only to INDOPACOM, but also to organizations like the East-West Center, the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, the Pacific Forum, and the University of Hawaii that have had decades of experience working in the Pacific Islands and building deep relationships. These organizations bring unique strengths in convening officials and experts in the region to address our shared challenges. It is critical that our national efforts to expand our engagement in the Pacific Islands build on Hawaii's position as a bridge and leverage the deep expertise and relationships in Hawaii. We've also been boldly leading with regard to climate change and sustainable development, perhaps the most important issue facing the Pacific Islands today and for generations to come. We have among the most ambitious clean energy transformation goals in the world. Our Hawaii Green Growth Network stewards the Aloha Plus Challenge and was designated by the United Nations as one of a handful of local 2030 sustainable development hubs or centers of excellence in recognizing long-term sustainability goals. There is so much energy and focus around the Pacific Islands now, not just in the region or in Hawaii, but in the halls of Congress and beyond in Washington. This is an exciting time of great opportunity for all of us. And I believe that this engagement from the United States in this critical part of the world will only continue to grow in the coming years. I look forward to continuing our work in advancing our shared interests and values in a free and open Indo-Pacific. Mahalo, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Representative Case. That was terrific, and especially for flagging your work and legislative activities and founding of the Pacific Islands Caucus, of course, and flagging Hawaii's role with all of our organizations. We now turn to sort of a diplomatic view from our Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, David Stilwell. He has, of course, been in that position since 2019, but previously spent 35 years in the service of the United States Air Force and of the country, and one of his retiring ranks and roles was as an Asia advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he brings enormous Asia expertise, both from the military background, but also now in his current diplomatic role. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Stilwell, for joining us.
Satu, thank you also for letting me participate and to be amongst such an august group as the AID administrator. Two folks from Congress. Congress has been a great partner in all this. So Representatives McCaul and Case and my fellow state resident Case, thank you. And then Admiral Davidson, my old boss, still have a lot to learn there. You know, as a resident in Hawaii, I think, and East-West Center, of course, based in Hawaii, I think we have a unique perspective on all of these things, just due to proximity and situation. The fact that, you know, all the hurricanes and climate issues and all the stuff that affect the area we're talking about are reflected in Hawaii as well. If you notice my map behind me, I was helped by my staff to actually expand this thing from a fairly narrow, tight look at East Asia Pacific to a much larger map that includes the Pacific, all the way out to Hawaii, if you look out there. And this, as was said, occupies a huge amount of space, and I agree with Admiral Davidson as to the strategic importance of that space. And so you gave me the benefit of being described as diplomat. I know others would take issue with that description, but let me just give you how it looks from my staff and from where I sit. So the strategic level assessment of the issue starts with assessment of interests, and free and open and prosperous Asia Pacific is that in a nutshell, but specifically we're looking at stability. Get ahead of things before they become problems. Indo-Pacific does a great job of this with humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and other things. But the elephant in this room is China, and the stability of the region, economic stability for one, is being threatened. And this is why we are having this conversation today. We need to take steps to address that. Maintaining access, economic access, and mutually beneficial trade with the region. We mentioned IUU fishing, preserving EEZs for these countries, which is their primary source of income, and making sure that their fish stocks and other things are available for them for the long term. Credibility and reputation is also a major issue that we don't give enough credit. Our interest here is to live up to our commitments, because it stands in great contrast to others who make promises but don't follow up on them, what we call empty promises. And then the system that's provided peace and security for 70 years is also being contended, and we want to make sure that we get in that game. America is at its best when we are competing, and we are in full competition now as we demonstrate the benefits of a free and open democratic system of governance, free of corruption, I might add. So the problem statement, the status quo is being upended by a number of things, climate and others, but China is the major one here. If you think of actually a brilliant move to abscond with Graham Allison's concept of the Thucydides trap, the summary of that says the status quo power, us, needs to make way for the up and coming rising power, China. And a lot of people bought into that simple argument, but I would say it's too simplistic. It's a competition. Let the region decide which they prefer. All of this has given the Pacific region greater visibility, and I think that's a good thing. It's an area that we may have neglected at our own, to our own detriment. So I mentioned EEZs and stable economies. I mean, there are other things, obviously. Cinnamon from Pohnpei, I learned when I was a participant at the East-West Center. But again, maritime domain awareness and those things are an important aspect of what we can provide to allow these countries in the region to benefit from its resources. So our response to all of these things, the problem statement, a strategy I'll lay out in ends, ways, and means, typical strategic construct, but I'll reverse it to be ends, means, and ways. So our ends, peace and stability and prosperity, simply put, status quo. The way things were is the way things have worked best, and these new type governance formulations have already proven to fall well short. And our job in messaging is to make sure that people understand that. We're trying to support sovereignty. And then if you saw from Peter Berkowitz and crew, the latest paper called Elements of the China Challenge, we're trying to preserve freedom, a simple way of identifying the plan here. Here's the means. We're always going to talk money. Money's the first thing people think about. There's other ways. I'd like to talk more about ways, but as Administrator Barsa noted, there are lots of investments in the region. I'll just name a few here. He mentioned the Pacific Pledge, $300 million. Overall, the U.S. agencies invest about $350 million in the region per year. We support good governance, we support security and all those other things. 130 million so far in support of the COVID response in the region. State Department and Treasury provided $2 million grant for the Pacific Financial Technical Assistance Center that strengthens the resilience of the Pacific Island economies against debt distress and the problems that we are all suffering economically with Corona. The U.S. Trade and Development Agency announced a new support for Papua New Guinea. State Department's working to enhance people ties. Again, working with East-West Center and others through the launch of the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs in Fiji and $2 million program helping women and girls address barriers to gender equality in the freely associated states. So those are the means, but let's talk ways. These are what Churchill says, gentlemen, we're out of money. Now we shall have to think. These are things that we actually not that hard. One, show up. You saw Secretary Pompeo visit to Micronesia last summer as he announced the renegotiation of the compact associated speech. The president hosted the three leaders of the freely associated states, and then the secretary on the sidelines of the General Assembly hosted the Pacific Islands Forum. We cooperate with allies and partners, increased cooperation with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea was mentioned as well. There's synergies there to be had, and we found a lot of overlap in the region. And then the Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative. Much of this is simply have to shine a light on the issues, and they tend to go away using John Garneau's formulation. And so in messaging the Pacific Islands Project, as we allow access to New York Times and other broader networks, so they're not completely captured by propaganda coming out of Beijing. Pacific Islands Dialogue is another area. So I'll just wrap up by note. We talked about Solomon Islands, building a new compound there, the Peace Corps showing up there again. There's much to be addressed. There's more work to be done, but I do think that the response has been timely and sufficient, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Stilwell. Not only did you cover the diplomatic and sort of framing our diplomatic approach, but I particularly appreciated your mentioning of civil society links, the educational human capital development links, such as the Peace Corps and others. So thank you very much indeed. At this time of the program, we are moving to a moderated discussion. And for this, I want to introduce one other colleague who is an official in the US government who will join us for this portion. And I would welcome everyone to be on camera if they are able. And that's Ms. Gloria D. Steele. She's currently serving as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Asia after leading for almost 4 years the Bureau of Asia at USAID. And it's a pleasure to see you again, Ms. Steele, and welcome to this program. Thanks so much for the moderated discussion. Let me kick off because we have just under 30 minutes and I want to try to extract as much as possible from all of your policy expertise from all of you. Ms. Steele, could you say a little bit more, Mr. Barsa touched on it, on how the USAID is specifically building partnerships with allies and like-minded countries on development projects? Mr. Barsa mentioned Palau and the undersea cable, but I wonder if you could elaborate on that. And also, what is the nature of our development approach assistance to the region? And why do we take this particular approach? Mr. Stilwell alluded to this as well, the way in which we do things. Could I ask for you to spend a little time on those two questions, please?
Thank you very much, Satu. Thank you for the warm welcome. In the Pacific Islands region, probably in more than any other region where we work, USAID works in very close partnership with like-minded partners. Acting Deputy Administrator Barsa talked about our work in Papua New Guinea on electrifying, making electricity accessible to a bigger proportion of the population. In that particular project, we work with Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, again, working with them. The reason that we work in collaboration with other partners is so that we can maximize the impact of the program, leverage each other's resources, and also reduce the transaction costs for the countries. We are quite aware of the limited human capacity in the countries that we work. We have very small populations in those countries, and so we do not want to duplicate each other's work. Mr. Barsa also talked about the Palau undersea cable, and we are working again with Australia and Japan in that. And we are actually complementing the investment by Taiwan on the Palau's domestic telecom network. We also heard about our program in Solomon Islands, again, together with like-minded partners such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan. We are supporting the development programs of the Solomon Islands in that area. And then in COVID programming, we worked with Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, and Korea in providing assistance, COVID-19 assistance, and also in delivering the ventilators to Fiji, Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, and Nauru. We are also supporting the Pacific Islands Forum, which has, as you know, 18 member countries, again, also in COVID by supporting programs, delivery programs to the World Food Program. And you ask about the approach. In all the countries where we work, and especially in the Pacific Island countries, what we do is work to make the countries become more self-reliant. We want them to be able to plan and finance and implement their programs, be in a position to be able to do that, which is very important. We want them to be able to have a choice in the development trajectory that they take, rather than be dictated upon or be in deep debt, unsustainable debt that others may take. We also have learned over the years that in order to maximize impact of development assistance, we need to make sure that the programs are country-led. We need to make sure that they have local capacity to be able to lead their programs. We need to make sure that we focus on results and accountability. And I talked about the coordination so that we do not put too much demand on the countries. And in the Pacific Islands, we have a particular focus on addressing the major threats the rising sea levels, the extreme temperatures, and of course the smallness of the markets that they're located in, and the distance from major markets in the world. And so we focus on the issues that actually are the biggest constraints of their development, work with other donors, but most importantly, work with the local, the host government and the local organizations to lead that development program so that it's their own, not ours. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Steele. I really particularly appreciated you sort of emphasizing, underlining that point about giving the region key elements of human capital development and choice in their development projects, and the working with our allies and partners on specific development projects, as well as deconflicting generally. So that's terrific. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Admiral Davidson from Indo-Pacific Command. You touched a little bit on this, but I want to push a little bit more, Admiral. The Maritime Security Initiative has slowly expanded its geographical coverage over time and now includes the Pacific. It started out sort of in Southeast Asia and has moved to South Asia and Pacific Islands. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the range of maritime challenges that you're addressing through MSI, and specifically as it applies to the Pacific. And then secondly, and not unrelated, could you talk about how INDOPACOM works specifically with the U.S. Coast Guard in the region? Ambassador O'Brien, National Security Advisor, announced a couple weeks ago, I guess it was, about our plans to deploy fast cutter assets to American Samoa and to Guam over time. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how that fits into your work there.
Well, thank you very much, Satu. I appreciate the two questions, and hello to my fellow panelists and question takers here. Ms. Steele, thank you for joining us, and Secretary Stilwell and Congressman Case, it's great to see you guys. Thank you. If you don't mind, Satu, I'll take the second question first. So you have National Security Advisor O'Brien's comments right on. And I'll make two comments about our relationship with the Coast Guard. First, the Coast Guard has independent responsibilities of INDOPACOM that are manifest throughout the wider Pacific Ocean, and deploys routinely to the Pacific Island chain and conducts many of the kind of operations and support mechanisms that I commented on in my earlier comments directly with other nations. In other words, to put it shortly, they don't necessarily deploy under our authorities. I have a very close relationship with Admiral Fagan, Vice Admiral Fagan. She is the area commander for the U.S. Coast Guard. And of course, the commander of Coast Guard District 14 actually lives here in Honolulu as well. And he's actually the direct operational control of those units. But like I said, they help facilitate shipwrighter agreements, facilitate patrols of American territory, EEZ, certainly, but in combination with our partners in the region. And they help deliver the kind of training that provides maritime domain awareness, all the way down to things like mechanical support and training for engines and things like that. There are times that Coast Guard assets conduct operations under INDOPACOM authority. They have done that as recently as this year with a single deployment out to the Western Pacific. We're grateful for that partnership and the security that they provide there. They actually have deep, deep relationships across the whole of the Indo-Pacific, particularly in fishing administration and law enforcement, counter drug enforcement as well. That is so profound in its ability to build on those relationships and actually conduct combined patrols and support and that kind of thing. To your first question, yeah, the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative was increased with the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. Of course, it supports the development of common regional maritime pictures, increased information sharing across the region. It helps provide, in my view, reassurance to our regional partners while helping to build and sustain our maritime partnerships. And as you mentioned, it expands this year beyond Southeast Asia and South Asia into the Pacific Island chain, what we call 3 Oceania subregions, but 12 countries alone, specifically the Federated States of Micronesia, the independent state of Samoa, the Kingdom of Tonga, Papua New Guinea, the Republic of Fiji, the Republic of Kiribati, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Republic of Nauru, Republic of Palau, the Republic of Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, and then Tuvalu as well. And of course, you know, beyond the characteristics I highlighted before, it helps facilitate some of the exercises that INDOPACOM commands and controls in the region. These include exercise CCAT, our series of CARAT exercises, as well as our maritime exercise and advisory support to help enhance our interoperability with other nations. So that's a great improvement on our ability to engage across Oceania and the Pacific Island chain. I'm grateful for what the Congress has provided and the President has signed for there. And I look forward to evaluating, you know, what the first pass through on this is, and to see where it might take us in terms of future investment and engagement with our partners. Thank you, Satu.
Thank you, Admiral. That's terrific. And I'm sure you're very grateful for the support of Congress, both authorization through the NDAA and the appropriations to do this work. But of course, it's more work for you all to do out at INDOPACOM. So I'm sure you have a lot to do. We now turn to Representative Case, and I was a little nervous in framing this question because you've stood up with your co-chairs, the Pacific Islands Caucus. You've written with colleagues and counterparts your Blue Pacific legislation, but I've got to ask you, what's next in the 117th Congress? How will you move the legislation forward and expand and enhance the work that you're already doing? And in particular, how do you see the state of the progress of negotiations on the very important COFA agreements that we have out in the region?
Thanks for that question. First of all, on the compact negotiations, they are proceeding. Secretary Stilwell might know a little bit more about that. But my impression is that although there are, issues to be worked through, the commitment from everybody is to renew the compacts. And so I'm supportive of them. I'm not nervous about them getting done. I think good people at the table on all sides are going to get that done. And I think everybody realizes the critical importance of the compacts, not only to our country but to the compact countries themselves. And so that one's going fine. I don't think it needs a bunch of congressional meddling in it. And as long as things keep on moving along, my intention is to encourage it and massage it forward, and then go to bat in Congress for it. In terms of our Pacific Islands Caucus and the Blue Pacific Act, hey, we set up a great framework. I think a Pacific Islands Caucus, coordinated, nonpartisan, people focused on the Pacific. The Blue Pacific Act was really quite a development. We did that act a little differently from a lot of bills that get introduced into Congress. We actually went out to all of the countries and said, here's our concept. Here's our premise. Our premise is that the United States wants to remain involved and increase our involvement in the Pacific Islands. But our premise is also that involvement is oftentimes a little too scattershot. It's not broad enough. It's not coordinated enough. We've got, INDOPACOM there, who has just done an incredible laboring oar on many of the outreach efforts, but maybe they shouldn't have to do all of that. Maybe that should be taken up elsewhere in our government and spread it around and coordinated. And so we went to the countries themselves in the Pacific Islands. This was a bill that was really developed, not just in my office or anybody else's office in Congress in the abstract. It was a joint development with the Pacific Island countries, as well as many of our partners around the Pacific. And I go back to Australia, New Zealand, those countries. We consulted directly with those countries. What do you want this to look like, and what is needed? And so the answer came back. We put it into that bill. We're going to run out of time this Congress to pass it. We were really right on the verge of getting it out, but a little too late to get it out. I'm hoping that it will come out early next year. I'm hoping that it will be recognized really as quite a revolutionary effort in our Congress. I know for a fact, and you were hosting a seminar the other day when we spoke with the Pacific Islands, who made specific mention of the fact that they regard it as really an incredible advance and development. But then you got to deliver on it. So, great idea. There it is. It does authorize at least a tripling of our overall aid to the Pacific Islands across the board in the non-security sphere. In other words, not directly through defense spending, but through everything else. By the way, we are increasing our defense spending to the Pacific Islands also. I'm on the Appropriations Committee, and definitely the focus there is on increasing INDOPACOM's outreach. But we need to substantially increase the non-defense spending to the Pacific Islands. This bill authorizes that to happen, but we have to follow through in the appropriations process as well to get it done. And so, the table is set. I feel very good about, the meal coming, and we're gonna chase it very early in the Congress. The partners are all set up. So far, so good. I would be remiss if I didn't go back to one point that has been raised, and that is that through the BUILD Act and other initiatives, we have to increase our development presence and the funding of our development presence and assistance throughout the Pacific Islands. That's where there are desperate needs, especially in a COVID-19 environment in which the economies which are dependent on tourism have been devastated. And that's when many of these countries are most susceptible to the so-called debt trap. And we can't allow the situation to give rise to increased leverage that is anti all of our interests in the Pacific Islands. And so I think this is very much going to be on our minds as well as we move into the next Congress, which is only 2 months away.
Well, thank you very much for your leadership, Representative Case, and particularly that spirit that Ms. Steele and Assistant Secretary Stilwell also spoke about, this issue of choice, that you consulted with the Pacific Island countries, including our allies such as Australia and New Zealand, about your legislation. I think is a sign of the way we're approaching the region through your leadership. So thank you very much. Let me turn to Assistant Secretary Stilwell for a couple of questions. A running theme through all of this, many of our speakers today, has been, a very unique, I don't want to say it's a ways, it's a means, but also an end as part of our values, is to work with allies and partners. And I wonder, you mentioned partners, but I'd like to ask you a little bit more. Of course, Australia and New Zealand have come up. But we hear now even our Atlantic allies and NATO partners are beginning to, they have sovereign assets and sovereign equities in the region, whether that be France or UK. How do you see the prospect of building those alliances and partnership specifically in the Pacific region? And also I'd like to ask you, we've talked about our US approach today. I asked you just now about the allies and partners. Could you say a little bit about our approach to the multilateral engagement? How are you thinking about what opportunities might exist to further enhance our support for region-wide efforts? PIF and the Pacific Islands Forum has been mentioned. I would welcome your thoughts on that, Assistant Secretary Stilwell.
Well, thanks for that. And again, chance to explain the thought process here. You mentioned the like-mindeds we don't often think about in the region. Japan is one that I was happily surprised to understand, not just in Southeast Asia, where they have been a fantastic partner. And you mentioned multilateral, Japan's recent announcement with Australia on, taking a more deliberate strategic partnership, something that got China's attention, has been very helpful. And that accrues not just to the mainland and the territorial, but it accrues to the entire region. And so the Quad was good. 2+2, we took up this topic in our recent conversation here in DC. Every time Foreign Minister Payne comes to the US, she has to go self-isolate for 2 weeks. And I think she's got like a month and a half in isolation so far. But she wants to have these conversations in person. And they are very important in that regard. Now, you mentioned France, though. That's one because of Tahiti and New Caledonia and those other interests that we have also maybe not taken full advantage of. I speak to the French embassy here at least monthly, and that relationship was surprising to me. Also surprising is the amount of interaction I've done in the Quint here, an arrangement of US and European friends talking about an issue as the 17+1 lands on their doorstep. Again, this is not a Pacific issue, but it is helping everyone understand what I laid out as the problem statement, and then ways that we can address it and manage it. I don't think we're going to, drive it away, but I think if we can help the Chinese see clear to cooperate on these things, and the outcome is basically the same, is to listen better, to coordinate better, to smoothly on-ramp with the system in existence that's been of great benefit to all of us. Other multilateral, I think what you'll see is more and more multilateral organizations form. I mean, I don't think we're done yet with these new, and you mentioned the PIF. Our actions, my good looks, and this fantastic hairline, of course, have brought them tighter together. But it's also, again, the actions of others that have made them rethink how good things have been and will be if we continue to support a international system that benefits all. And so, as I said, the Secretary hosted a PIF at the General Assembly. A lot of other plans for this sort of thing. Pandemic, which is unfortunate, but we're taking advantage of media like this, like Zoom, to continue those conversations. And again, those conversations are increasingly easy, and we're getting good inputs from others instead of the U.S. being the one driving this train anymore. In some ways, we're actually following others' lead and joining in and becoming a more cooperative partner, vice maybe slightly a strong leader, let's put it that way. And so lots of opportunity. I guess finally, I'll note the Pacific Caucus and our relationship with the Congress has been very easy. Coming into this job, I was always concerned about maybe confrontational, but again, with the Hill, with the Congress and the Senate, both parties, all that, it's been very productive. I think in summary, our biggest challenge here is gathering it all together and taking maximum advantage of all the opportunities that were presented. And again, thanks to East West Center and others for bringing us together for these conversations.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Stilwell. That's great, and great to know about some of those lines of effort that you mentioned, the Quint and working with France and others who share values and objectives with us. We're very close to the end of our time, but I want to sort of do a lightning round. Here we are. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot going on in our country. People have economic concerns, health concerns, pandemic issues, etc. You all have eloquently described the enhanced nature of our engagement with the Pacific, building on long-standing, historical, enduring ties. How would you, very quickly, starting with Ms. Steele, just explain to the American people why now it is so important to remain engaged and to enhance our activities in the Pacific? Ms. Steele.
Thank you. I think that what's happening right now with COVID-19 is telling us that what happens in anywhere in the world affects us in a big way. And so it is important that we work with other countries to make sure that there is transparency, that the health issues are addressed and known at the time they're happening, so we can prepare for ourselves. Also, when other countries are prosperous, we have markets for our goods and services. And finally, and I think it's important, is because that's an American value. Helping other countries is an important American value. Promoting social justice is an important American value that we want to share worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. I know, Admiral, you have a hard break, so we'd love to hear just your closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Satu. I think Ms. Steele hit it right on the head. The United States has been a Pacific nation since its founding. One of our oldest treaties was signed in 1830 with Thailand. So it shows the extent of U.S. interests really throughout our history. And when you look over the previous 80 years and certainly what the international order delivered at the end of World War II, it's that nations that have like values and a mutual interest in their prosperity and their security should be working together in order to defend those freedoms. It's been the privilege of a lifetime for me personally to work alongside our Pacific allies and partners. I feel a deep responsibility across the whole of the region for their security, and we'll continue to engage with them along the lines I just said to meet the security concerns and help build on our mutual prosperity and defend our values. So thank you, Satu, for the opportunity today.
Thank you so much, Admiral. I appreciate it very much, your time. Mr. Case.
You know, we've seen 3 generations now of the absence of a world war. Of course, we've had conflict, but it has been a relatively peaceful world for 3 generations, and that's because countries of this world have agreed on, for the most part, on an international rules-based order based on common shared values, shared principles, whether they be democratic values or economic advancement or humanitarian assistance to each other. We've hung together as a family. And the Pacific Islands are part of that family. And the Pacific Islands are at a critical stage in their own development, their own needs. And they're a critical part of our world for a larger geopolitical, strategic reasons. And I believe that the Pacific Islands want to choose to be part of the world that has maintained that peace for 3 generations, but we cannot take that for granted. If we leave them to themselves, if we disengage, if we ignore, if we don't show up, they will have no choice but to take different directions. And I believe that if we do engage on a coordinated basis, if we do show up, if we do assist, if we do treat them with a mutual respect, that they will choose to continue down the path that has, I think, been beneficial to most of this world. But it takes effort. It doesn't take just coasting along on it. It takes concerted, coordinated effort, and that's what we're up to with the Pacific Islands Caucus and the Blue Pacific Act.
Thank you so much, Mr. Case. Mr. Stilwell.
So I'll just simply add that up till now, I think a lot of us Americans and the region have taken this idea of rule of law, values, and all those things for granted. I've become cynical, and now that we've got a contrasting approach to compare it to, people are beginning to understand exactly how important it is. And so this has really made my job, and I think others, easier. We can talk about values and rule of law and how people know what the opposite looks like.
Thank you so much. I have to say, after listening to all of the remarks, including Mr. Barsa and Mr. McCaul, who unfortunately could not join for this portion of the program, I really do feel that the coordination and the enhancement that you've spoken of is underway, and the expansion of our activities in the region is well led and well curated by officials such as yourself. So I'm really grateful to you for the time and the effort and the energy and the foresight that you have on our relations with the Pacific and to build this enduring relationship. And thank you for sharing your time with the East-West Center. I'm not at all going to try and compare the East-West Center's activities, but I do want to flag that the East-West Center has also been long involved, along with University of Hawaii, as Representative Case mentioned, and other organizations in dealing with whether it be military and police and security officials from the region, or scholars, academics, officials, civil society folks, artists, the whole range of society. And so we play our small part at the East-West Center, and working closely with Mr. Case and the Pacific Islands Caucus. I just want to note that here in Washington at the East-West Center, we will be producing, as part of our Asia Matters for America series, through support of the Caucus and the Department of Interior Office of Insular Affairs, a new publication that gives a useful tool and a reference tool for congressional staff, media, the general public, academics, and civil society on the Pacific, so that they'll have a ready-to-go-to tool about our engagement, our relations with the region. And we'll be bringing that out in the 117th Congress, as well as looking to start a new congressional staff program on Asia. We already are doing a congressional staff program on the Indo-Pacific, and we're looking forward to doing a series of perhaps 5-7 staff programs that will allow staff to be brought into this, so that there's more training and more development of expertise and knowledge. And with that, I bid all of the 275 plus participants from whatever time and whatever location they're joining, as well as whatever platform, whether it's YouTube or Zoom. Thank you for joining us. And once again, a sincere thanks to Mr. Barsa, Representative McCaul, Admiral Davidson, Representative Case, Ms. Gloria Steele from the Asia Bureau, and of course, Assistant Secretary Stilwell. Mahalo, thank you very much. Good day, and thank you for your work on U.S. Pacific Islands relations. Good day.